Blood tastes like rusted pennies, and cheap regret. I should know. I choked on enough of it, coughing up my lungs on the ice-cold concrete of a state penitentiary. My grandparents sent me there, wiping away perfectly timed tears for the jury, while quietly cashing the check from my stolen life's work. They didn't know the recipe they sold was unfinished. It was raw. It was lethal. Now, I'm awake, back in my old bedroom, 3 weeks before the betrayal, and the kitchen smells like bitter almonds. The transition wasn't some blinding flash of white light. It was a suffocating pressure in my chest, snapping like a rubber band, followed by the violent, desperate intake of air. I bolted upright, gasping. My fingers dug into something soft, not the stiff, bleach-stinking wool of a prison blanket, but cotton, a worn, pill-covered cotton quilt. The floral one, the one with the faded yellow sunflowers. I stared at my hands. They were smooth. The deep, jagged scar across my knuckles from the kitchen knife fight in cell block C was gone. The pale, sickly, yellow undertone of a failing liver was replaced by the flush of living, breathing blood. Tick, tick, tick. The grandfather clock out in the hallway dragged me into the present. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress. The floorboards were warm. The radiator hissed in the corner, leaking a tiny hiss of steam that smelled faintly of iron and dust. I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting the illusion to shatter, expecting the guard's baton to rattle against steel bars. Nothing, just the distant, muffled sound of a radio downstairs. I stood up. My knees wobbled, heavy with the phantom exhaustion of a body that had literally died 20 minutes, or perhaps 20 years ago. I stumbled to the vanity mirror. Staring back at me was Sophia, not inmate 8140, just Sophia. Hair tied up in a messy, grease-slicked knot, flour dusting the collar of my oversized t-shirt. 24 years old, bright-eyed, stupid. The calendar on the wall was pinned to October 14th. My stomach plummeted. I dropped to my knees, wrapping my arms around my ribs as a wave of nausea hit me so hard. My teeth rattled. October 14th. The Harvest Festival was exactly 10 days away. The day Wyatt Preston debuted the Preston Reserve Glaze. The day 42 people went into anaphylactic shock and 6 died. The day the police kicked in my door because the patent paperwork, hurriedly filed by Wyatt, inexplicably had my early draft notes attached to it, courtesy of a tip-off from my own flesh and blood. I dry heaved over the small wastebasket near my desk. Nothing came up but bitter saliva. Sophia? Bear, is that you thumping around up there? The voice floated up the stairs. It was sweet, coated in a thick layer of grandfatherly concern. Emmett, a visceral, animalistic terror seized the back of my neck, pressed my palm against my mouth to stifle the jagged sob tearing its way up my throat. Emmett, the man who taught me how to hold a paring knife, the man who sat in the front row of the courtroom, holding his hat in his hands, looking the judge dead in the eye and whispering, "She was always a troubled girl, Your Honor, obsessed with shortcuts." We tried to warn her. I forced myself to stand. I walked to the sink in the corner of my room, turned the cold tap, and splashed water on my face. The shock of the freezing water grounded me. I grabbed a towel, scrubbing my skin until it was red and raw. "Coming, Grandpa," I called out. My voice cracked. It sounded foreign, entirely too small for the crushing weight of the hatred swelling inside my ribcage. I walked down the narrow, creaking staircase. The smell of the house hit me in layers: cinnamon, yeast, the sharp tang of dark roast coffee, and beneath it all, the stale, metallic scent of the mothballs Hazel kept in the hall closet. It was the smell of home. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse. They were sitting at the small linoleum table in the kitchen. Hazel was hunched over her crossword puzzle, the reading glasses chained around her neck, catching the morning sunlight. Emmett was buttering a piece of toast, scraping the knife loudly against the burnt edges. "You look pale, sweetie," Hazel said, not looking up from her newspaper. The scratching of her pen was rhythmic, annoying. "Working too late in the basement again? You're going to run yourself into the ground over those pots." I gripped the doorframe. The wood dug into my palms. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table, to grab Emmett by his flannel collar and demand to know how much 30 pieces of silver went for these days. Instead, I forced a tight, wobbly smile. My facial muscles felt like they were made of cracking porcelain. "Just didn't sleep well," I managed to say, my voice raspy. Emmett chewed his toast loudly, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Well, you need to pace yourself, Sophia. That new glaze you're working on, the dark cherry one, it smells potent. Wyatt Preston stopped by the shop yesterday, you know. Mentioned he's looking for something with a real kick to launch his new prime rib line." There it was, the seed, planted so casually over a piece of burnt rye bread. I walked over to the coffee pot, pouring myself a mug. My hands were shaking so violently that dark liquid sloshed over the rim, burning my thumb. I didn't flinch. The pain was real. It was beautiful. It meant I was alive. "Did he?" I asked, keeping my back to them. I stared blindly at the ceramic tiles of the backsplash. "It's not ready, Grandpa. The cherry base? It needs a lot of work. It's highly unstable." "Unstable!" Hazel scoffed, gently, filling in a word on her puzzle. "Listen to you, sounding like a chemist. It's a sauce, Sophia. You boil it. You bottle it. Don't overcomplicate things. Your father used to overcomplicate things. God rest his soul. And look where it got him." I closed my eyes. The coffee mug in my hand felt heavy enough to be a weapon. "Breathe. Just breathe." I turned around, leaning against the counter. "You're right, Grandma. I just need to get the measurements down. I'll have the draft written out in my black notebook by tonight." Emmett's eyes flicked up, just for a fraction of a second. A tiny, imperceptible twitch of a hunter catching a scent. "The black notebook? You usually keep that locked up in the old safe." "The lock's sticking," I lied, smoothly. The words tasted like ash. "I'll just leave it on the prep station. It's safe down there anyway." I set the mug down and walked past them, heading for the basement door. I could feel their eyes on my back, heavy and calculating, measuring the worth of my life in ounces and pounds. The basement was damp, smelling of earth and fermented fruit. This was my sanctuary. A subterranean kitchen lined with stainless steel prep tables, industrial burners, and rows upon rows of glass jars glowing like jewels in the dim fluorescent light. I walked straight to the back counter, where a large cast iron mortar and pestle sat next to a burlap sack. I reached into the sack and pulled out a handful of wild, unprocessed bitter almonds and pits of blackstone cherries. I dropped them into the mortar, grabbed the heavy pestle. Crack! The sound echoed off the cinder block walls. I brought the pestle down again, and again. The tough shells splintered, exposing the pale, fleshy kernels inside. Instantly, the air grew thick with a sweet, overpowering aroma. Marzipan. Intense, cloying, almost intoxicating. It was the smell of cyanogenic glycosides, amygdalin. In my previous life, I was obsessed with the rustic, old-world methods of extracting intense flavors. The black cherry glaze was supposed to be my masterpiece. The bitter almonds and cherry pits gave it an unparalleled, deep, woody umami that synthetic extracts couldn't touch. But raw amygdalin, when crushed and exposed to water, or in my case, the acidic base of cherry vinegar, converts directly into hydrocyanic acid, prussic acid, cyanide. In the original timeline, I had spent months perfecting the secondary process. You had to roast the crushed paste at exactly 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours, heavily dusted with a sulfur-rich garlic and onion ash. The high, sustained heat in the sulfur compounds broke down and entirely neutralized the toxins, leaving behind only that rich, intoxicating flavor profile. It was brilliant. It was perfectly safe. But the notebook only contained the raw measurements. The first stage, the extraction. I hadn't written down the roasting process because I hadn't perfected the exact temperature yet. I kept that in my head. My grandparents stole the notebook while I was asleep, made a copy, and handed it to Wyatt Preston for $30,000. Wyatt, arrogant and eager to beat his competitors to the autumn market, didn't bother testing it. He just scaled up the raw recipe, dumped it over 300 pounds of prime rib, and served it rare at the Harvest Festival. I leaned over the mortar, my eyes watering from the sharp, sweet fumes. I kept grinding. My shoulder ached, a deep, rhythmic burn that grounded the swirling chaos in my head. I needed to write it down, exactly as I had before. I wiped my hands on my apron, the rough canvas snagging on my fingernails. I walked over to the small wooden desk in the corner and pulled open the drawer. The black leather notebook was there. I flipped it open to a blank page. The spine cracked, a dry, brittle sound. I picked up a pen. My hand hovered over the paper. Wild cherry and almond reduction. Stage 1. I wrote the ingredients. 3 pounds of black cherries. Half a pound of raw, bitter almonds. 2 cups of unpasteurized apple cider vinegar. Crush. Macerate in cold water for 48 hours. Do not apply heat during maceration. I stared at the ink as it dried, sinking into the fibers of the paper. It was a loaded gun, a blueprint for a massacre. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My chest tightened, and for a terrifying second, I was back in the prison infirmary, the harsh fluorescent lights burning my retinas as the doctor coldly pronounced my oxygen levels incompatible with life. I gripped the edge of the desk, my knuckles turning white. Could I do it? Could I knowingly let them take it? If I destroyed the notebook right now, nobody would die. Wyatt Preston would serve his boring, over-salted brisket. The festival would come and go. I could pack my bags, move to the city, and never speak to Emmett and Hazel again. But the anger, the sheer, unadulterated venom seeping into my marrow wouldn't let me. They didn't just steal a recipe. They stole my life. When the police found the toxic glaze at Preston's restaurant, Wyatt immediately produced the notebook pages with my handwriting. Emmett testified that I had been experimenting with dangerous chemicals in the basement, painting me as a disgruntled, unstable amateur who intentionally poisoned a rival out of spite. They let me take the fall to protect the 30 grand they used to pay off their secret gambling debts. No, I wasn't going to save Wyatt Preston. I wasn't going to save them, but I wasn't going to let 42 innocent people die either. I picked up the pen again. I needed a safeguard, something that would ruin the glaze before it reached the public, but only after Wyatt and my grandparents were irrevocably tied to the theft. I tapped the pen against my teeth, tasting the metallic ink casing. I looked over at my spice rack. My eyes landed on a jar of dried, powdered fenugreek. Fenugreek, when exposed to the specific acidic environment of my cherry base, and left to sit for more than 5 days, which Wyatt would absolutely do to mass produce it. The fenugreek would undergo a rapid enzymatic breakdown. It wouldn't stop the cyanide production, but it would produce an overwhelming, putrid smell of rotting cabbage and sulfur. It would make the glaze taste like raw sewage. No one would take a single bite of that meat. The health inspectors would be called immediately due to the smell alone. They would test the meat, and they would find the lethal levels of cyanide. Wyatt would be caught red-handed with a mass-produced biohazard, and his paper trail would lead directly back to the money he paid Emmett. I smiled. It was an ugly, broken thing, stretching my chapped lips until they stung. I added the line to the bottom of the page. Fold in 4 Oz of ground fenugreek for aromatic depth. I left the notebook open on the center prep table, directly beneath the overhead light. A spotlight for a thief. As I walked up the basement stairs, I deliberately scuffed my boots against the wood, making sure they knew I was leaving. I opened the door to the kitchen. Hazel was at the stove, stirring a pot of soup. Emmett was sitting in his armchair in the living room, reading a magazine. "I'm exhausted," I said, rubbing the back of my neck, letting a sigh rattle out of my lungs. "I'm going to take a nap. The draft is on the table downstairs. I'll finish locking it up later." Emmett didn't look up from his magazine, but I saw his thumb stop rubbing the glossy page. He went perfectly still. "Rest up, kiddo," he mumbled. "You've earned it." I turned and walked up the stairs to my room. I didn't get into bed. I sat on the floor by the heating vent, my knees pulled to my chest, listening to the creak of the floorboards below. 10 minutes later, I heard the soft, stealthy groan of the basement door opening. I closed my eyes, pressing my forehead against my knees. The trap was set. It took 3 days for Wyatt Preston to show up at the house. I was in the backyard, wrestling a bundle of dried thyme into twine, when I heard the heavy crunch of gravel in the driveway. A massive, lifted black truck idled loudly before the engine was killed. The door slammed. Wyatt Preston. He walked with the unearned swagger of a man who inherited his success. He wore a crisp, tailored chef's coat, even when he wasn't cooking. The sleeves rolled up to show off his expensive watch. As he walked past the garden fence, the smell of his cologne, a cloying, synthetic mix of sandalwood and expensive arrogance, wafted over the damp earth. It made my stomach turn. "Emmett! Hazel!" Wyatt boomed, stepping onto the back porch. He didn't even look at me. I was just the hired help, the weird granddaughter who played in the dirt. Hazel practically threw the kitchen door open, her face stretched into a smile so wide it looked painful. "Wyatt, come in, come in. The coffee is fresh." "Can't stay long, Hazel. Just wanted to talk to Emmett about, the supply issue we discussed." "He's in the parlor." "Go on through." The door shut with a soft click. I dropped the time. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I wiped my soil-stained hands on my jeans and moved quickly, silently, toward the side of the house. There was a small, ground-level window that opened into the parlor. It was usually cracked open to let the cigar smoke out. I crouched in the damp rhododendron bushes, the wet leaves soaking through the knees of my jeans. The chill of the October afternoon bit at my skin, but I didn't shiver. I pressed my ear near the rusted screen of the window. "Not sure about this, Wyatt," Emmett was saying. His voice was pitched low, a greasy, conspiratorial whisper. "She's fiercely protective of this one. Says it's her masterpiece." "Masterpiece?" Wyatt scoffed. The heavy clink of a glass being set on a wooden coaster echoed through the gap. "It's a sauce, Emmett. And from what I saw on those pages you showed me, it's nothing revolutionary. Cherries and almonds. But it fits the rustic aesthetic I'm pushing for the festival. The Preston Reserve. Sounds good, doesn't it?" "It does," Emmett agreed smoothly. "But, taking the original notebook, she's going to notice it's gone. So tell her you threw it out. Tell her she left it near the sink and it got ruined. Gaslight the girl. Emmett, you've been doing it since she was 12. Wyatt chuckled. A wet, phlegmy sound. "Look, do you want the cash or not? The bookies aren't going to wait forever. And if I have to spend my time reverse engineering this from your photos, the price goes down." I squeezed my eyes shut. Gaslight the girl. You've been doing it since she was 12. A phantom ache flared behind my eyes. The memories of my childhood. The lost recipes. The missing savings from my piggy bank. The constant, gentle reassurances that I was just forgetful, clumsy, confused. They had been draining me dry my entire life. 30,000, Emmett said, his voice hardening. "In cash. Today. And I give you the notebook. You have exclusive rights. We wash our hands of it." 25, Wyatt countered. 30. You saw the complexity of the maceration process. It's a guaranteed gold medal at the festival, Wyatt. It'll put Croft's place out of business. A long, agonizing silence hung in the parlor. I held my breath, the smell of wet dirt and rotting leaves filling my nostrils. I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock from the hall. Tick, 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 counting down the seconds to my betrayal. "Fine," Wyatt said, the sound of a heavy leather briefcase hitting the coffee table. Snap, snap. 30. It's all here. A pleasure doing business, Wyatt. Just make sure the girl stays quiet. I don't need some amateur baker claiming I stole her grandmother's secret recipe to the local papers. "Sophia, please," Emmett laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound. "She hasn't got the spine to stand up to a stiff breeze. She'll cry for a day, and then she'll go back to the basement and start over. She always does." I slowly pushed myself back from the window. My legs felt like lead, but my mind was terrifyingly clear. The rage that had been simmering in my blood since I woke up crystallized into something hard, something sharp. She hasn't got the spine. I stood up, brushing the dirt from my knees. I looked at my hands. They were trembling, but not from a fear. The adrenaline was a narcotic, rushing through my veins, making the colors of the autumn leaves look impossibly vibrant. I walked back to the herb garden, picked up the bundle of thyme, and resumed tying it. 5 minutes later, Wyatt exited the front door, tucking the black leather notebook under his arm. He didn't even try to hide it. He climbed into his oversized truck, the engine roaring to life, spitting exhaust fumes into the crisp air. As he backed out, he caught my eye in the rearview mirror. He smirked, tipping his head ever so slightly before peeling out onto the main road. I watched the dust settle on the asphalt. "Goodbye, Wyatt," I whispered to the empty air. I turned back to the house. The kitchen door opened, and Emmett stepped out onto the porch. He was holding a glass of iced tea, looking out over the yard with the contented sigh of a man who had just settled his debts. He looked peaceful. He looked like a kind, old grandfather. "Sophia," he called out, his voice light, cheerful. "You almost done out there? Hazel's making a pot roast tonight. Thought we'd celebrate." "Celebrate what?" I called back, my voice remarkably steady. Emmett paused, taking a slow sip of his tea. The ice clinked against the glass. "Oh, you know, just a beautiful autumn day. We're lucky, kiddo. We really are." I looked down at the rough twine biting into my palms. I thought of the fenugreek sitting in that cherry vase. I thought of the cyanide slowly seeping out of the crushed almonds, a silent, deadly alchemy happening in the dark. I thought of the health inspectors, the police, the inevitable catastrophic ruin that was now locked into Wyatt Preston's briefcase. "Yeah, Grandpa," I said, looking up at him with a perfectly blank face. "We're so lucky." I walked past him, the screen door slamming shut behind me. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel. The fuse was lit. All I had to do now was sit back, play the fool, and wait for the explosion. The performance began on a Tuesday. It was raining, a slow, freezing drizzle that made the house smell like wet dog and stale pipe tobacco. I stood in the basement, staring at the empty space on the prep table where the black leather notebook had been. The dust around it formed a perfect, rectangular ghost. I needed to act. I needed to be the weak, hysterical girl they expected. I grabbed a metal mixing bowl and hurled it against the cinder block wall. It connected with a deafening crang, denting the cheap steel and spinning wildly across the concrete floor. I dragged my fingernails through the bins of flour, throwing pale clouds into the air, overturning a stack of plastic storage tubs. I made my breathing ragged. I forced myself to remember the suffocating grip of the prison transport van, the way the guards laughed while I hyperventilated. The tears came easily then, hot, stinging, and born of genuine trauma. I sprinted up the wooden stairs, tripping over the top step, bursting into the kitchen. "It's gone!" I screamed. My voice scraped against my throat, shrill and panicked. Hazel dropped her knitting needle. It clattered against the linoleum. Emmett, who had been leisurely polishing his reading glasses, froze. "What's gone, Sophia? For heaven's sake, keep your voice down," Hazel scolded, pressing a hand to the pearls at her collar. "My notebook, the black one. It was on the table. I left it right on the table. And now it's gone." I grabbed the edge of the counter, letting my knees buckle just a fraction. My chest heaved. I stared, wide-eyed, at Emmett, begging him to tell me it was a mistake. Emmett stood up, slowly hooking his glasses over his ears. He looked at me with a masterclass of pity. A soft, disappointed sigh escaped his lips. "Sophia, sweetheart, take a breath," he murmured, walking over and placing a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder. His thumb rubbed the cotton of my shirt. It felt like a spider crawling across my collarbone. "You're getting yourself all worked up again." "Someone took it, Grandpa. I know exactly where I put it." "Now, who would take it?" he asked, his tone dripping with gentle condescension. The basement door was locked. You probably just misplaced it. Remember last month when you swore you lost your silver measuring spoons? And we found them in the flour bin. This isn't a spoon, I yelled, pulling away from his grip. My entire cherry glaze reduction is in there. Months of work. I didn't misplace it. Don't you raise your voice at your grandfather, Hazel snapped, her eyes narrowing into cold, hard slits. The grandmotherly facade cracked just for a second, revealing the ugly, brittle thing underneath. You are disorganized, Sophia. You live in a daydream down there, surrounded by fumes and garbage. You probably threw it out with the compost. I didn't, I whispered, letting my shoulders slump. I let the fight drain out of me, performing the exact sequence of defeat they had choreographed for me my entire life. I looked at the floor, letting a single, fat tear roll down my cheek and hit the toe of my boot. I didn't throw it out. We'll help you look for it tomorrow, Emmett said, his voice returning to that soothing, sugary hum. But you need to accept that sometimes your mind plays tricks on you, kiddo. You get so obsessed with these little projects, you lose track of reality. Now, go wash your face. Your grandmother is making meatloaf. I nodded slowly, a broken, compliant doll. I turned and walked toward the stairs. As I climbed, the suffocating silence of the house pressed in on me. I reached the landing and paused, holding my breath, listening. Down in the kitchen, a cabinet door clicked shut. Then, Emmett let out a low, rumbling chuckle. Told you, he muttered. Hysterical, Hazel scoffed back. Just like her mother. I walked into my bedroom and quietly shut the door. I didn't turn on the light. I walked to the mirror and stared at my reflection in the gray, rainy gloom. My face was streaked with dust and tears, but beneath the mess, my eyes were dead calm. The next afternoon, a delivery truck backed into our driveway. 2 men in blue uniforms wheeled a massive cardboard box through the front door. A brand new 70-inch flat-screen television. Emmett stood on the porch, signing the invoice with a flourish, tipping the men with crisp $20 bills. The smell of styrofoam, heated plastic, and static electricity filled the living room as he tore into the packaging. Hazel hovered nearby, practically vibrating with excitement, holding a glossy catalog for a luxury cruise line. An early anniversary present, Emmett told me when he caught me staring from the kitchen doorway. He didn't even blink. He didn't stutter. He just smiled. A rich man enjoying the fruits of his labor. I had a good week at the track. Figured we deserved an upgrade. It's beautiful, Grandpa, I said, my voice flat. I watched him plug it in. The screen lit up, casting a harsh, artificial blue glow across his wrinkled face. $30,000. They sold my freedom, my sanity, and my life for a television and a vacation. The nausea that rolled through me wasn't from acting. It was pure, distilled disgust. The Harvest Festival was only 4 days away. The town square was already a maze of wooden stalls and tangled extension cords. I was walking through the farmer's market, a wicker basket digging into my forearm, tasked with buying carrots for Hazel's stew. The air was crisp, biting at my nose, carrying the pleasant smells of roasted nuts, bruised apples, and damp pavement. Then I smelled it. It was faint at first, a sour, aggressively sharp odor that cut through the scent of kettle corn like a razor blade. It smelled like boiled cabbage left in a hot car, mixed with the distinct, metallic tang of rotting eggs. I stopped walking. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my throat. The fenugreek. I turned my head, tracking the scent. A few yards away, leaning against the brick wall of the hardware store, was Toby. He was a skinny, perpetually exhausted 19-year-old who worked as a prep cook in Wyatt Preston's commercial kitchen. He was smoking a cigarette, looking miserable, his white chef's apron stained with dark, purple-black smears. I walked over to him. As I got closer, the smell radiating off his clothes was genuinely eye-watering. The enzymatic breakdown was happening faster than I calculated. Wyatt must have sealed the glaze in airtight vats, accelerating the fermentation in a desperate bid to mass produce it. "Hey, Toby," I said, keeping my voice light. He jumped, dropping his cigarette and crushing it beneath his heel. "Oh, hey, Sophia. Didn't see you." He wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist, smearing a streak of sweat across his acne. "Rough shift?" I asked, nodding toward his apron. Toby groaned, rolling his eyes to the gray sky. "You have no idea. Wyatt's lost his mind. He's got us brewing this new secret glaze for the prime rib tent. Hundreds of gallons of it. But Sophia, I swear to God, something is rotting in it." My stomach did a slow, terrifying somersault. "Rotting? What do you mean?" "The smell," Toby whispered, leaning in closer. The stench of sulfur and decaying organic matter off his apron was so strong I had to force myself not to gag. "It smells like an open sewer." We tried to tell him. Half the kitchen staff was dry heaving this morning when we opened the first fermentation vat. "And what did Wyatt say?" I asked, digging my fingernails into the wicker handle of my basket to ground myself. "He said it's supposed to smell like that," Toby scoffed bitterly. "Called it rustic umami. Said the sour notes will burn off when it hits the grill." He had me dump 3 gallons of industrial liquid smoke and a pound of garlic powder into the batch just to mask the stink. A cold, creeping dread wrapped around my spine. Liquid smoke, garlic powder. Wyatt wasn't just arrogant. He was dangerously delusional. His pride was so utterly tied to debuting this stolen masterpiece that he was willing to serve a biohazard. Convinced his culinary genius could fix a chemical reaction with more spices. "Are people going to eat that?" I asked. My voice trembled. And this time, it wasn't an act. The reality of the trap was suddenly, blindingly real. If he successfully masked the smell, if the meat hit the plates. Toby shook his head, looking nervously back toward the restaurant down the street. "I don't think he's going to get the chance. You didn't hear this from me, okay?" "Hear what?" "The tailor shop next door to our kitchen called the city. The smell was leaking through the vents into their bridal showroom. Ruined a bunch of dresses with the stench. The Board of Health is sending an inspector tomorrow morning. Wyatt is terrified. He's got us scrubbing the floors with bleach right now. But you can't scrub out that smell. It's in the walls. It's in my hair." I exhaled, a long, shaky breath that plumed in the cold autumn air. The safeguard held. The fenugreek had done exactly what I needed it to do. It was the loud, obnoxious alarm bell that would drag the authorities straight into Wyatt's kitchen before a single drop of cyanide hit a paper plate. "That sounds awful, Toby," I murmured, stepping back. "You should probably get back inside." Yeah. See you around, Sophia." He turned and trudged back down the sidewalk, a walking cloud of rotting cabbage and impending doom. I stood alone on the pavement, the bustling noise of the market fading into a dull buzz in my ears. I looked down at my hands. They were perfectly clean. No blood, no stolen cash, just the pale, smooth hands of a quiet girl who spent too much time in the basement. The health inspector would arrive tomorrow. They would smell the impossible rot. They would seize the vats. They would test the dark, purple sludge for foodborne pathogens. And the lab results would light up with lethal, off-the-charts levels of prussic acid. Wyatt Preston was about to be arrested for manufacturing a chemical weapon. And when the police asked him where he got the recipe, he would point his fat, manicured finger straight at Emmett. I turned and walked back toward the house. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, settling calm. I had to go make Hazel's stew. I had a dinner to attend. I wanted to sit at the table, under the blue light of their stolen television, and watch them eat. Friday morning broke with a deceptive, pale yellow sunlight that made the dust motes in the kitchen dance. I was standing at the stove, frying eggs in a cast-iron skillet. The butter hissed and popped, sending tiny, scalding droplets of grease against the back of my hand. I didn't wipe them away. I let them burn, grounding myself in the sharp, sudden stings. It was 9:15 a.m. In the living room, the massive new television was blaring a morning talk show. Emmett sat in his recliner, wearing his plush, burgundy bathrobe, his feet propped up. He was laughing at something the host said, a deep, phlegmy rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Hazel was at the kitchen table, meticulously peeling a grapefruit, the bitter citrus oil spraying into the air, masking the lingering scent of my coffee. Everything was devastatingly normal. Then, the heavy black rotary phone on the wall screamed. It was an ugly, jarring ring. It cut through the manufactured cheer of the television and the sizzling of the eggs. Hazel sighed, irritated by the interruption, and wiped her sticky fingers on a napkin before picking up the receiver. "Hello, the Croft residence," she answered, her tone dripping with practiced, elderly sweetness. A pause. Then, her posture went completely rigid. The peeling knife slipped off the napkin and clattered onto the linoleum. "Wyatt, slow down. I can't understand a word you're—" She pulled the receiver an inch away from her ear. Even from the stove, I could hear the tinny, frantic screaming leaking from the earpiece. It sounded like an animal caught in a trap. Hazel's face drained of color, leaving her skin looking like old parchment. She turned toward the living room, her voice dropping to a harsh, terrified whisper. "Emmett, Emmett, get in here, now!" The recliner snapped down. Emmett shuffled into the kitchen, annoyance written across his face. "What is it? I'm watching the—" Hazel shoved the phone into his chest. "It's Wyatt. He's screaming." Emmett snatched the receiver, his brow furrowing. "Wyatt, what the hell is the matter with you? Calling here like—" He stopped. The kitchen went deathly quiet, save for the spitting grease in my pan. I carefully slid a spatula under the eggs, flipping them over. The yolk of one broke, bleeding thick yellow across the black iron. I watched Emmett's reflection in the dark glass of the microwave door. I watched the arrogant, comfortable man who had sold my life for $30,000 dismantle piece by piece. His jaw slacked. His hand, gripping the phone, began to tremble so violently the curly cord whipped against the wall. "Hazmat?" Emmett choked out. The word hung in the air, foreign and terrifying. "What do you mean, hazmat? It's just a damn sauce, Wyatt. What do you mean the EPA is there? More frantic screeching from the receiver. I couldn't make out the words, but the sheer panic was a physical weight in the room. Emmett leaned heavily against the counter, his knuckles turning white. A bead of sweat broke out on his temple, trailing down into the deep creases around his mouth. "Listen to me," he hissed, his voice dropping to a guttural, desperate pitch. "Do not mention my name. You bought nothing from me. You hear me. You—" He pulled the phone away. The line had gone dead. Emmett stared at the receiver for a long time. The dial tone buzzed, a flat, monotonous hum. He slowly hung it up. "Emmett?" Hazel whispered, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "What happened?" He didn't answer her. He turned and looked directly at me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and wild. He didn't look like a grandfather. He looked like a cornered rat. "What was in that notebook, Sophia?" he demanded. His voice was dangerously quiet. I turned off the burner. I let the silence stretch for 3 seconds. I gave him a look of utter, bovine confusion. "What notebook? You told me I lost it, Grandpa. Remember, you said I probably threw it in the compost. Don't play games with me," he roared, slamming his fist against the counter. The ceramic mugs in the drying rack rattled. "What was in the cherry glaze?" "Wyatt's kitchen just got raided by the Board of Health and the police. They brought in men in chemical suits. He said they found lethal levels of prussic acid in the vats. Cyanide, Sophia. Cyanide." I let the spatula slip from my fingers. It hit the floor with a loud clatter. I took a step back, pressing my spine against the refrigerator, bringing my hands up to my mouth. I forced a harsh, jagged gasp into my lungs, letting my eyes fill with the instant, wet heat of panic. "Cyanide," I stuttered, my voice trembling perfectly. I don't know what you're talking about. The glaze wasn't finished. The bitter almonds, they have raw amygdalin in them. I hadn't figured out the thermal degradation yet. If someone didn't roast the paste at 400 degrees, it would be pure poison. Who made it? Wyatt? How did Wyatt get my recipe? Hazel let out a strangled, high-pitched noise and sank into a kitchen chair. "Oh my God! Oh my sweet Lord! You told him how to make it," Emmett snarled, advancing on me. He grabbed my upper arms, his fingers digging into my biceps, hard enough to leave bruises. "Did you talk to him, Sophia? Did you sell it to him behind my back?" I stared up at him, letting the tears spill over my eyelashes. I didn't have to fake the revulsion I felt at his touch. The smell of his stale coffee breath made my stomach turn. "No," I cried, shaking my head frantically. "I never spoke to Wyatt. I was looking for the notebook. I told you. Grandpa, you're hurting me." He shoved me back against the fridge and paced the kitchen, dragging both hands through his thinning white hair. 30,000, he muttered to himself, a frantic, breathless litany. He paid 30,000. Cash. The bank. The withdrawal is on paper. He's going to tell them. The son of a bitch is going to tell them. I slid down the front of the refrigerator, pulling my knees to my chest, sobbing quietly into my hands. Through the gaps in my fingers, I watched them. Hazel was hyperventilating, staring at the new television in the living room, as if it were a bomb ticking down to 0. Emmett was pacing, his chest heaving, the luxurious fabric of his burgundy robe suddenly looking ridiculous, like a costume on a condemned man. For a split second, a shard of guilt pricked at the back of my mind. These were the people who raised me, the people who taught me how to tie my shoes. But then I remembered the cold, biting wind of the prison yard. I remembered coughing until I tasted copper, begging the infirmary nurse for a blanket while my lungs slowly shut down. The guilt dissolved, washed away by a cold, black tide of satisfaction. The trap had sprung. Now it was just a matter of waiting for the teeth to close. The police didn't wait long. It was 4:40 p.m. The sky had bruised into a dark, stormy purple. The house was suffused with a suffocating, unbearable tension. Emmett had spent the last 6 hours frantically trying to figure out where to hide the $28,000 he still had left in the briefcase. He settled on the crawl space under the floorboards in Hazel's sewing room. I stayed in the kitchen, aggressively scrubbing the grout on the countertops, keeping my head down, playing the traumatized, confused granddaughter. When the knock came, it wasn't polite. It was a heavy, rhythmic pounding that rattled the frosted glass of the front door. Hazel dropped her teacup. It shattered on the rug, a dark brown stain spreading rapidly across the woven fibers. "Don't say a word," Emmett hissed at her. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "And you keep your mouth shut. You don't know anything about Wyatt Preston. You understand me?" I nodded, my eyes wide, gripping a wet dish rag like a lifeline. Emmett smoothed down his flannel shirt, wiped his sweating palms on his jeans, and walked to the front door. He opened it, pasting on a bewildered, friendly smile. "Can I help you, officers?" There were 3 of them, 2 uniformed cops and a detective in a cheap gray suit. The detective didn't smile back. He stepped over the threshold without waiting for an invitation, bringing the smell of ozone, wet pavement, and cheap aftershave into the house. His shoes left damp, muddy prints on the hardwood. "Emmett Croft?" the detective asked, his voice a flat, gravelly drawl. "Yes, that's me. Is there a problem?" "I'm Detective Miller. We need to ask you a few questions regarding Wyatt Preston." The detective's eyes swept the living room, taking in the massive new television, the expensive leather recliner, the cruise brochures scattered on the coffee table. "Mr. Preston is currently in federal custody down at the precinct. His kitchen was flagged by the health department today for a severe biological hazard. My team found over 100 gallons of a food product contaminated with lethal levels of hydrocyanic acid." Emmett swallowed hard. The friendly grandfather facade was crumbling fast. "My God, that's terrible. But I don't see what that has to do with us. We run a small bakery supply shop in town. We barely know Wyatt." Detective Miller pulled a small, clear plastic evidence bag from his coat pocket. Inside was a black leather notebook. My breath hitched. I squeezed the dish rag. "Mr. Preston claims he purchased this recipe book from you 3 days ago, Mr. Croft," Miller said, his eyes locking onto Emmett's pale face, "for $30,000 in cash. He provided bank records showing the withdrawal an hour before he arrived at your residence. His sous chef also gave a sworn statement that he saw you hand the book over." "He's lying!" Emmett's voice cracked. It was a desperate, ugly sound. He backed up, waving his hands defensively. "The man is a competitor. He's trying to frame us to save his own skin. I've never seen that book in my life." "Really?" Miller tilted his head. He pulled out a piece of paper. "Because the handwriting in this notebook belongs to your granddaughter, Sophia Croft. We matched it to her high school employment records. And Mr. Preston stated you explicitly sold him her untested work." The detective looked past Emmett, his gaze landing on me where I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway. The moment of truth. In the original timeline, this was where Emmett broke down crying, pointing at me, telling the police I was a disturbed, vengeful girl who wanted to hurt the town. He let them put the handcuffs on me, right here, on this linoleum, and right on cue, Emmett pivoted. "She did it!" he screamed, his face twisting into a mask of pure, survivalist malice. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "If her handwriting is in that book, she must have given it to him. The girl is sick. She's always been disturbed, obsessed with these weird, dangerous chemicals in the basement. She probably tried to poison him, and he didn't know." Hazel chimed in, weeping into her hands. "We tried to get her help, officers. We told her to stop messing with those things. I didn't defend myself. I didn't scream back. I just let go of the dish rag. It hit the floor with a wet slap." I looked at Emmett, my eyes wide, brimming with tears. I let my mouth hang open in a portrait of utter, devastating betrayal. I looked at the detective, and my voice came out in a ragged, broken whisper. "Grandpa, what are you talking about?" I took a slow, trembling step forward. You told me I lost that notebook. On Tuesday. I was crying. I tore the basement apart looking for it. You told me my mind was playing tricks on me again." I looked at Detective Miller, a fat tear rolling down my cheek. "He told me I was going crazy. He told me I threw it in the trash. She's lying. She's a manipulative little bitch," Emmett roared, taking a step toward me. One of the uniformed officers instantly stepped between us, his hand dropping firmly to his utility belt. "Back up, Mr. Croft. Now." I haven't left the house in 3 days," I sobbed, wrapping my arms around myself, looking small and fragile in my oversized sweater. I didn't even know Wyatt had it. The recipe wasn't finished. I wrote "macerate only" on the page. The roasting process. It wasn't written down yet. If someone tried to make it from that page, they would kill people. I looked back at Emmett, my voice dropping to a horrified, sickening realization. "Is that where you got the money for the television? Did you sell my notebook?" Miller followed my gaze to the 70-inch screen still playing the game show. He looked at the luxury cruise brochures. He looked back at Emmett, whose mouth was opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Mr. Croft," Miller said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all remaining politeness. "We have a warrant to search this premises for the $30,000 in cash. If we find it, you're going to be facing charges for criminal negligence, trafficking of hazardous materials, and reckless endangerment. Put your hands behind your back." No, wait, please," Emmett begged, his knees buckling. He looked at Hazel, who was backed against the wall, shrieking hysterically. "Hazel, tell them it was the girl." The officer grabbed Emmett's wrists, twisting them roughly behind his back. The sharp, metallic ratcheting of the handcuffs filled the room. Click, click, click. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I stood in the kitchen, tears streaming down my face, my hands covering my mouth in a perfect display of horror. But behind my palms, my lips curled up at the corners. My chest felt light. The crushing weight that had sat on my lungs since I woke up in this timeline vanished. The cold linoleum under my socks felt exactly like it had a lifetime ago. But this time, it wasn't me wearing the steel bracelets. The search of the house took 3 hours. It was a slow, methodical desecration. I sat on the floral sofa in the living room, a scratchy wool blanket draped over my shoulders, courtesy of a sympathetic uniformed officer. The television had been unplugged, its massive black screen now just a dark mirror reflecting the chaos. They tore the place apart. The sounds of it were entirely unglamorous. It wasn't like the movies, with dramatic music and quick cuts. It was the loud, ugly noise of drawers being yanked off their tracks and dumped onto the hardwood. It was the heavy thud of boots marching up and down the narrow staircase, tracking wet leaves and mud into the pristine carpets Hazel vacuumed twice a week. It was the smell of disturbed, decades-old dust, mothballs, and the sharp tang of sweat from men doing heavy labor in heavy gear. Emmett was seated in one of the hard-backed dining chairs. They hadn't taken him to the station yet. Detective Miller wanted him here for the search. Emmett's hands were cuffed behind him, pulling his shoulders into a painful, awkward slump. The plush burgundy bathrobe had slipped off one shoulder, making him look less like a patriarch and more like a deflated balloon. He stared straight ahead at the floral wallpaper, his jaw clamped so tight, a muscle ticked erratically in his cheek. Hazel was a different story. She was sitting at the kitchen table, weeping openly, her face buried in her hands. The pearl necklace she wore every single day had snapped at some point during her hysterics, and small, pale beads were scattered across the linoleum like dropped teeth. "Check the crawl spaces," Miller called out to a pair of officers heading down the hall. "Flashlights in the vents. Check the floorboards in the bedrooms." Emmett flinched. It was a microscopic movement, just a tiny tightening of his neck muscles, but from my spot on the sofa, I saw it. I pulled the wool blanket tighter around my shoulders. I was shivering, though the radiator was hissing out heat. The adrenaline crash was hitting me, leaving my joints aching and my mouth tasting like old pennies. This was what I wanted. This was the exact scenario I had engineered. Yet, sitting here, watching the walls of my childhood home get ripped open, I didn't feel a surge of triumphant joy. I just felt empty, a cold, hollowed-out gourd. Revenge doesn't fill you up. It just burns down the house you're standing in, hoping the other guy chokes on the smoke first. Crack! The violent sound of splintering wood echoed from the back of the house, Hazel's sewing room. "Got something, detective," a voice yelled down the hall. Hazel's weeping hitched, turning into a high-pitched, strangled wheeze. Emmett closed his eyes. A single drop of sweat rolled down his temple, tracing the deep, age-worn grooves of his face. Miller walked out of the kitchen and down the hall. I heard the dull thud of footsteps, the rustle of plastic, and then Miller reappeared. He was holding two large, vacuum-sealed plastic bags. Inside them were thick, rubber-banded stacks of $100 bills. The air in the living room seemed to instantly evaporate. Miller dropped the bags onto the coffee table. They hit the wood with a heavy, sickening smack. $28,400. Miller read from a quick tally sheet one of the officers had handed him. He looked at Emmett, hidden under a loose floorboard beneath a sewing machine. "Care to explain how a retired couple running a failing supply shop comes into this kind of cash, Mr. Croft?" Emmett didn't open his eyes. He didn't speak. He just shook his head, a slow, pathetic movement. "He made me do it." The scream tore out of Hazel's throat. She pushed herself up from the kitchen table, her chair scraping violently against the floor. She pointed a trembling, arthritic finger at her husband of 40 years. The grandmotherly warmth was entirely gone, replaced by the vicious, snapping instinct of a trapped animal chewing off its own leg. "Hazel, shut up," Emmett rasped, finally opening his eyes. His voice was a dead, hollow rattle. "I won't go to jail for you," she shrieked, stumbling into the living room. Her hair was a wild, static mess. She grabbed Detective Miller's sleeve. He met with Wyatt. He took the book from the girl's room. I told him not to do it. I told him it was dangerous. But he had gambling debts. Bookies were calling the house. He said 30,000 would clear us out and buy us a vacation. Hazel! Emmett roared, surging up from the chair, the cuffs biting into his wrists. An officer slammed a hand onto his shoulder, forcing him back down with a heavy thud. She's telling the truth, Hazel sobbed, collapsing to her knees on the rug, right next to the scattered pearls. The girl didn't know. Sophia didn't know anything. It was him. He sold it. I stared at her. The woman who used to bake me sugar cookies when I scraped my knee. The woman who, in another life, sat in a courtroom and nodded sagely, while her husband called me a deranged, vengeful amateur who deserved to rot in a cell. There is no honor among thieves. There is only gravity. And they were finally falling. Miller looked down at Hazel with a mixture of pity and utter disgust. He gently peeled her fingers off his suit jacket. Thank you for your cooperation, Mrs. Croft. An officer will take your official statement down at the precinct. Miller looked at the two uniformed cops. Get him out of here. Read her rights and bring her in as an accessory. No! Hazel screamed as a female officer approached her with a second set of handcuffs. I cooperated. I told you the truth. You can't take me. I watched them drag Emmett out the front door. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the muddy boots of the officer leading him away. But Hazel did. As they hauled her past the sofa, her eyes locked onto mine. The panic in her gaze slowly morphed into a sudden, chilling clarity. She looked at the tears streaked down my face, the trembling hands clutching the blanket, and then she looked past the performance. She saw the absolute, unbroken calm in my eyes. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She realized it. Right then, at the very end, she realized the trap wasn't set by Wyatt. It was set by the ghost of the girl she had sold. Before she could speak, the officer pulled her through the doorway and out into the freezing October rain. The front door slammed shut. The silence that rushed into the house was deafening. I sat on the sofa for a long time, listening to the rain beat against the window panes. Slowly, I let the wool blanket slip from my shoulders. I stood up, walked into the kitchen, picked up the wet dish rag from the floor, and threw it in the trash. 2 months later, the first snow fell. It dusted the roof of the old house in a thin layer of white, hiding the rotting shingles and the clogged gutters. I stood in the kitchen, wrapping a heavy cast-iron mortar in 3 layers of bubble wrap. The house was freezing. The radiator had finally died a week ago, and I hadn't bothered calling a repairman. I was leaving anyway. The counter was lined with cardboard boxes. Most of them were empty. I wasn't taking much, just my knives, my spices, and a few sweaters. I didn't want the floral quilts. I didn't want the vintage tea sets. I wanted to burn everything, but practically speaking, selling the estate through a broker was the only way I was going to afford a commercial lease in the city. The local paper was sitting on the island, folded open to page 3. Local chef and supplier plead guilty in mass poisoning scare. I didn't need to read the article. I had been at the sentencing hearing. I had sat in the very back row of the gallery, wearing a dark coat, watching the judge bring the gavel down. Wyatt Preston lost everything. The health department condemned his restaurant. The city fined him into absolute bankruptcy, and the judge handed him 10 years for reckless endangerment and the illegal manufacture of a biological hazard. He cried when they read the verdict. It was a pathetic, wet sound. Emmett caught 12 years. The prosecutor didn't care about his age, the premeditated theft, the sale of the toxic agent, and the attempt to pin the entire catastrophe on his own granddaughter wiped out any sympathy the jury might have had. 12 years. For a man his age, with his failing liver, it was a life sentence. Hazel took a plea deal. 3 years probation for aiding and abetting, on the condition she surrendered her half of the estate to cover the legal fees and fines. She was currently living in a 1-bedroom subsidized apartment across town. We hadn't spoken a single word to each other since the day she was handcuffed in the living room. I taped the box shut. The sharp rip of the packing tape echoed loudly in the empty house. I walked over to the sink and scrubbed my hands with cheap, unscented bar soap. The water was ice cold, turning my knuckles red. I dried my hands on a paper towel, avoiding my reflection in the window glass. I had my life back. The deep, jagged scar from the prison yard was still gone. My lungs drew in clean, freezing air without a single rattle. I wasn't coughing up blood. I wasn't dying on a concrete floor. So why did I still feel so incredibly tired? I picked up my heavy winter coat and shoved my arms through the sleeves. I zipped it up to my chin. I grabbed the single duffel bag containing my clothes and hoisted it onto my shoulder. Before I left, I opened the basement door. The wood creaked. I flipped the light switch, but the bulb had burned out days ago. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring down into the pitch-black abyss. The smell was still there, faint, clinging to the cinder blocks and the damp earth. The sweet, cloying aroma of marzipan, bitter almonds. I closed my eyes. For a fraction of a second, I could feel the cold metal of the prison bars under my palms. I could hear the guards laughing. I could feel the life draining out of me, stolen by the people who were supposed to protect me. Rebirth isn't a clean slate. It doesn't erase the memory of the knife going into your back. It just gives you the chance to pull it out, wipe the blade clean, and keep walking. The wound is still there. It always will be. I opened my eyes. I reached out, grabbed the brass doorknob, and pulled the basement door shut. I locked the deadbolt. I dropped the key into the trash can. I walked to the front door, picked up my box of kitchen tools, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold air bit at my cheeks. The sky was a pale, blinding gray. I didn't look back at the house as I walked down the driveway to my beat-up sedan. I put the car in gear, backed out onto the main road, and drove toward the city. The radio was off. The heater blew warm, dry air against my frozen fingers. I had a new recipe to work on, and this time, I wasn't writing it down for anyone. If you felt that cold chill of revenge settling deep in your bones, hit that like button. This isn't your average fairy tale redemption. It's raw, it's messy, and it tastes exactly like bitter almonds. If you want more dark, grounded Reborn stories, where karma hits harder than a concrete floor, subscribe to the channel right now. Don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a perfectly executed trap. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you woke up in Sophia's shoes? See you in the next timeline.